Hello, I'm Emma G.
I'm Jean Boase-Beier, and we're going to talk about Emma's book, which is a translation of Lucretius on the nature of the universe. I'm going to start by just saying a couple of words about Emma and about the book. Emma studied classics at the universities of Sydney and Cambridge, and she's taught classics at various places, including Exeter and Sydney and St Andrews. And to be very brief, I would say that Emma is a scholar, a translator, a student, a teacher. Well, and that's just some of them, I think. I'll just mention one recent book, not the book that we're now talking about, but another one, which is Mapping the Afterlife from Homer to Dante. And that appeared last year, 2020, with Oxford University Press. And the other book is the book that we're now going to talk about, which I've mentioned, which is the Lucretius, the translation of Lucretius on the nature of the universe. So I'm now going to hand over to Emma to read a few of the poems, and then we're going to discuss the book briefly.
Thank you very much, Jean. So the first reading I'm going to do is the very beginning of the poem, which is usually referred to as Lucretius's hymn to the goddess Venus. Imagine there's a goddess even. Let's call her the goddess of love. No Botticelli Venus climbing out of a shell, but nature, anarchic Aphrodite. She builds things up and then kicks them down again like an angry toddler. The selfish Jean, the pleasure principle. She fills to brim the ship enduring sea, crop heavy earth, coaxes every living thing beneath the sliding signs of heaven to leap into the light. The clouds scud escort when she comes. Architect Earth throws down the red carpet. The mirror sea blinks back the smiling sky. She flings the veil from day's spring face, slides back the bolts which stall the winds, shoots down the little birds mid-air, each one a sounding bell, struck through the heart. The whole dawn chorus, a reckless cascade of notes tumbling mi, re, do down from above. Bent on increase, she goads every species wild or tame to buck the winter off. Cross seas and mountains, ford foamy rivers follow where libido leads in an orgy of replication. You too. She'll flatter you into thinking you're in love, seduce you with cotton wool clouds and lambs, lull you with soft summer. Then she'll say, think you can come at me with your dragnets and carbon footprint? I'll truss your machismo up and crack your neck till you beg for mercy. Can this dominatrix turn our wars to love? Of course, for she rules all. Without her, no sun would ever rise above the holy borderlands of light. So she's the god I'd call to beat my song's bronze gong. The tart who starts the music, turns the stars, turns you on. The second piece I'm going to read is about unseen bodies, which create everything in the universe. I've taught that things aren't made from nothing, or once made, revoked to nothingness. But just in case you brand my words as much an act of faith as those religious ramblings I decry, because the primary bodies can't be seen, think about phenomena whose only explanation lies in unseen particles. First among these is wind. Wind's whirling lashes white horses, swoops on ships, rips clouds like kids pull fairy floss apart. Other times it builds up to a rant from threatening mutter, courses plains, a lethal spinning cone, or wraps around the woods. And when it leaves, the hills are dressed in matchstick tresses like Mount St Helens just by force of air. Wind's matter, dark to sight, sweeps like a massive broom. The sea sweeps earth, sweeps the clouds of heaven even, snatching them in sudden eddy. Wind is like a river, only one you can't see. Its unseen forces proliferate destruction by impulse, just as when water's gentle nature suddenly turns nasty, when rain upstream brings about a personality shift. A mountain-fed apocalypse, measuring its pressure in tens of tons, grabs whole chunks of forest, little islands with mini plantations riding on them, grinds boulders in its way like ball bearings, then hurls them down, a lethal Niagara. brushes ancient bridges aside with a dismissive gesture, and spreads destruction's effluent everywhere. Gusts of wind have to behave the same. With the same muscle as a river, they fall upon locations at their whim, propel things before their breath's rocket thrust, snatch them up where caprice takes them, build a crazy tower which walks the earth, poised in gravity-defying slow motion, whilst at its core, a hungry vortex whirls too fast for the eyes to see. The third passage I'm going to read is about Lucretius's aim in writing the poem and my aim in translating it. I'm well aware how obscure this stuff is. I write because I must. I'm ambitious, yes. The legal high of praise has its own attractions. But poetic inspiration spreads like coloured water up through filter paper, leaving rainbow strata in the fibres of my mind. And most of all because my verse gives power to Lucretius's lonely ghost to walk again in barefoot silence, solitary ground not skimmed by another's soul. He's right behind, when bold with joy I track the source of springs my childhood never knew, taste the water, take samples of the unrecorded species. I wind myself a writer's wreath from some aromatic new world leaf the ancient muses never thought of using to crown their poets. So I choose verse. First, before it, because it has the power to sever without pain religion's knots that bite into the flesh. And second, to make Lucretius's Latin shine and put a surface gloss on life's dark complexity. Have you seen a doctor give a polio vaccine to children? First they dissolve the serum in some sweet liquid, and then the babies, as yet unarmed against the hidden things they'll find beneath appearance when they're older, listen only to their tongue and swallow the whole lot down, caught out, not damaged, this time, by adult desire to deceive, but rather inoculated by such a simple trick. So too, Lucretius's doctrine seems unpalatable if you haven't tasted it. People are revolted by it, as by some strange smelly fruit. His Latin is difficult, impenetrable to most, not just because it's Latin, but because of what it says. And so I wanted, with these lines of honeyed song, to detain you in the Eden of my verse just long enough to show you the star-draped body of the universe.
Thank you, Emma. Very, very interesting and also very clear. Probably I should have said at the beginning that the book, I'm going to hold it up because people might just be able to see it, that this was published by ARC Publications. And one of the things that really struck us about this, looking at it, was the sort of modernity of the translation. But I'm just going to ask Emma a few questions, and so we can have a very brief discussion about the book. So, Emma, given Lucretius's philosophy and his views of what's important in life, do you think that he's a good poet for a pandemic?
Okay, well, just before I answer the question, I'd very much like to thank the people who've helped me with this work, because all art is collaboration. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, Jean, for helping with this, but also Angela Jarman and Tony Ward at ARC Publications for producing it so beautifully, and the poet and classicist Joe Balmer, who's given unstinting support over a number of years. So just thank you to all of those people. Now, just to answer your question, is Lucretius a good poet for a pandemic? I mean, yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Lucretius's poem is in 6 books, and at the end of the final book, the 6th book, he does actually have a description of a pandemic, which was a famous plague that happened in the city of Athens in 430 BCE. And the description of the plague follows on from his description of natural wonders of the world. So the passage that immediately precedes is the description of Avernian places where birds fly across a certain place and suddenly drop dead. And then he follows that with a description of the plague at Athens, disease in humans. So he moves from strange things in the universe to disease in animals to disease in humans. He has this extended description of the plague, which is an incredibly pessimistic ending to the work. And he does copy the plague from an earlier author, Thucydides, the Greek historian, but Lucretius changes the plague changes the emphasis of the plague. He's more interested in the psychology of what happens when there's a pandemic. And it's a very bleak picture, because what happens in Lucretius's pandemic is very much what's happened in our pandemic, which is he describes funerals that are rushed through without mourners, which has been one of the most shocking things about this pandemic. But he goes even further, and he explores the pandemic as an index of human nature. So the whole poem, over 1,000 hexameters in each book, he ends with a description of people fighting over pyres to burn the bodies of the dead, which is a terribly pessimistic image. In the economy of the poem itself, it's the sort of Epicurean poison chalice that we have to get used to the idea of dying. We have to get used to the idea of death. So this pessimism is something that the Epicurean has to absorb. But at the same time, the universe is neither hostile nor favourable to humankind. And that's the point that he's really trying to bring across, that the universe is not designed for us, which is something that I think in the present pandemic we're finding quite difficult to take, that there's this realisation that the universe is not designed for our benefit, and in some ways can seem hostile. But the corollary to that is that the universe and nature goes on. And the upside is that, the wildlife is coming back, for instance, during lockdown. So the beauty of nature continues. And for the Epicurean, we can contemplate nature, we can contemplate the impersonality of nature. And that in itself is a form of comfort, that nature goes on. So yeah, it's a good for a pandemic, I think.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that is, of course, really interesting. I mean, it suggests that that we have to accept the pandemic as a pandemic. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not hostile. It's not anything hostile. It's just the way things are, and we kind of make the best of it, difficult as it is. What would you say? I mean, apart from the usefulness of reading Lucretius in a pandemic, what would you say is the main thing that he has contributed to Western thought?
Okay, I mean, that's an enormous question. Lucretius, in some ways, has been for Western thought for most of Western history since the manuscript of Lucretius was rediscovered by Poggio in 1417. Lucretius has been very much a poison chalice. So we can't attribute Lucretius with bringing the notion of atoms into the Western psyche. People already knew about atomism, and atomism was present before Lucretius in his mentor Epicurus, and also in earlier philosophers in the 5th century BCE. But what Lucretius did when he was rediscovered was he really forced the notion of atomism upon the Western consciousness. And he does, this is picked up. So Renaissance and Enlightenment philosophers and scientists such as Francis Bacon and even Isaac Newton professed to be atomists. They would have been familiar with Lucretius. So atomism is something that Lucretius brought to Western thought. You also have to remember that what Lucretius meant by atoms and what Epicurus meant by atoms is not what we mean by atoms. So atomos in Greek is uncuttable, something which can't be cut. And obviously for us, atoms can be cut. This is what Duncan Kennedy in his book Rethinking Reality about Lucretius refers to as meaning incommensurability, that we're not actually talking about the same thing. So it's not quite true to say that Lucretius brought atomism into Western thought. He did force atomism upon the Western consciousness. And this was a very dangerous idea. And in fact, up until the middle of the 18th century, people were still writing and reading anti-Lucretian polemics. So it was such an important idea that people fought tooth and nail against it for a very long time. So his atomism is a significant idea that he brought to Western thought. But I would say his relevance for us is slightly different. That the message that I take from Lucretius is that that heterodoxy is okay, that you must always, it's always been there. People have always argued against the flow. And what's really important for us to do is to question everything and look at everything and get under the skin of everything. So as I say in one of my poems, poem 8, the sun's weapons, brittle lances of light, can't scatter the mind's black horrors, only if we peel open nature and look in. So I think that spirit of inquisitiveness and iconoclasm is really what he's brought to Western thought.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one of the things that really interests me is the way that you've translated this. And as I said before, I was really struck when I first read it by the way that you translated it. It reads in a very modern way, and yet it doesn't. It's not kind of wildly different from the original. So it's not a kind of what people like to call a domesticating translation. It's not that at all. What would you say were the main points? I mean, obviously one could discuss this for hours, but what would you say were the main points about the way that Lucretius writes that caused you perhaps difficulties as a translator, and how did you deal with them?
Okay, so the genesis of the translation, I mean, this is worth saying that the translation was not intended as a scholarly translation. It's not that it isn't, because in some ways it is, but it was intended as a translation for, 16-year-olds who've never come across poetry or classics before. And there are various strategies that I use on the microcosmic and the sort of macrocosmic level. So, for the poets and the classicists amongst readers, I really wanted to get under the skin of the Latin as well. And there are certain ways in which I did that. So, for instance, the bit that I read, the first extract that I read, I wanted to try and convey the roughness of Lucretius's hexameters, because when you read, say, Virgil's Aeneid, it's like breakers breaking on the sand. It's this ongoing, smooth, rhythmic rise and fall. But with Lucretius, it's not like that at all. So his hexameters and his sound world are very rough. So the bit that I read about the birds that are struck through the heart and the whole dawn chorus, reckless cascade of notes tumbling mi, re, do down from above, is intended actually to convey the rhythm of the Latin there. So the Latin says tuumque significat initum per culsi corda tu a vi, ending with a monosyllable. So it's a very ungainly line. And the mi, re, do, down from above, corda tu a vi. So it actually tries to mirror the rhythm of the Latin. So I've done that where I can, but also I think it makes quite a good effect in the English, because for the English reader, it's the strangeness of the sound world as well that comes across. So that's one thing I do on the microcosmic level. I also use formulae. So one thing that epic poetry does in Latin is it uses formulae. And I've not always reproduced Lucretius's formulae, so he'll repeat whole segments of hexameter lines and move the formulae around in the line. But what I've done is I've sometimes created my own formulae. So, for instance, one of the theme words in Lucretius is kaikos, which means blind. But in the Latin, the adjective kaikos can have both an active and a passive meaning. So it can mean blind, as in not seeing, but it can also mean blind as in unseen. So where I see the word kaikos in the text, I will translate it dark to sight, meaning that atoms, particles are there, but they're dark to our sight. We can't see them. So it kind of gets that, the two modalities. But also with kaikos, the blindness or the unseeingness of atoms is obviously very important to the Epicurean worldview. The world isn't designed with divine providence in mind. So, and it's so the blind watchmaker image is something else that I try and get across. So this dark to sight formula tries to capture that. Also, you will have noticed when you say it's very modern, quite shameless about using anachronism. And there's one particular passage, which is not one that I read, but where I talk about, Lucretius says of Anaxagoras, that if you follow Anaxagoras's theory, bones under the microscope would be made of tiny bones, because Anaxagoras thought that everything was made of tinier and tinier fractals of itself. And an expert classicist, when I read this at a conference, they were faintly horrified, I have to say. But she also said, well, I've often wondered what it would be like if Lucretius had a microscope. And look, you've given him one. So using anachronism is a way that I try and get the very striking imagery in Lucretius. I try and update that by deliberately using anachronism. And some of my colleagues like it and some hate it. On the macro level, I think what I've done is I've left out anything that I thought would be alienating to the 21st century reader. So, for instance, Latinists will have noticed that I've left out Lucretius's patron, Memmius. So Memmius was a patron of the arts who patronized Lucretius and Catullus, among others. But he's been left out. So I just refer to my dearest friend in my translation. And my rationale for that is that people are not going to want to go away and look up Memmius. And also they're not going to be familiar with this idea of a patron necessarily. So I've substituted Memmius with just a very general sort of addressee friend figure. I've also, something I decided to do quite consciously was to convert Lucretius's myths into metaphors. So the passage on the hymn to Venus that I just read, Venus is, she's a problem for Epicureans because the Epicureans didn't believe that the gods had an active role in the world. And so in Lucretian scholarship, there's always this question, what's Venus doing there? And so what I've done is I've converted her into a sort of tool for thinking with. So imagine there's a god. So we're just imagining what it would be like, and then she becomes more and more vivid as you move through the hymn. So I've converted the mythical goddess into a sort of imaginary tool. Also in the poem, or the beginning of the poem, Lucretius has a vignette of the love affair of Mars and Venus. Now, you won't have found that in that bit that I just read. And the reason for that is because I've taken away the scene of Mars and Venus being caught in flagrante in the net of Vulcan, which was a very famous classical myth, Mars and Venus as lovers caught by Vulcan in his net as they were committing adultery. I've taken that away, and instead I've used the Mars and Venus episode as a sort of metaphor for the ecological impact of humankind, i.e. Mars, upon nature, i.e. Venus. So, but she's got the upper hand because she's saying, I'll crack your neck until you beg for mercy. But that's a translation of actually a very tender scene in the Latin where Mars is looking up adoringly into the face of Venus. So I've changed the whole emphasis of that and made it into an ecological metaphor. So those are some of the strategies that I use. And I think one reason I've done that is because Lucretius is very good at making us re-examine myth, not just classical myths, which he uses throughout the poem, usually in a skeptical, ironic, sarcastic way, but also I think he's good at making us examine our own mythologies.
Yeah, thanks. My view is that for what it's worth, you're the translator, and the translator can basically do what they want. And so one of the reasons that things like anachronism or even rewriting or leaving things out or adapting things, one of the reasons that this is possible and acceptable is because the translator writes what they want to a certain extent. They're interpreting and they're presenting somebody else's work, and so you have the freedom to do that. And what it does, of course, is allow Lucretius to live in a way which he wouldn't do otherwise. So anyway, we do have to stop there. So just to repeat, this is the book On the Nature of the Universe, Book 1, by Lucretius. It's translated by Emma G, and it appeared with ARC Publications in 2020. So we'll stop there, and bye from me. And
thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.